Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the strangest and most overlooked standoffs in global politics, a war that started over a pig. Yes, a pig. But as we'll uncover, this so-called pig war wasn't really about livestock, it was about sovereignty, pride, and the blurry lines of empire. So here's the question. How does an international military standoff erupt between two world powers without a single shot fired at each other? And why did it all come down to a few islands and an overeager hog? To answer that, we need to rewind to the mid-1800s and zoom in on a crucial, often misunderstood treaty. In 1846, the United States and Britain signed the Oregon Treaty. It was supposed to bring clarity to their long-standing border disputes in the Pacific Northwest, and in many ways, it did. But like so many rushed agreements in history, it left one very critical detail unresolved: sovereignty over the San Juan Islands. The treaty's language was, frankly, a mess. It vaguely defined the boundary as the channel separating the mainland from Vancouver Island, but there were two channels, and each led to a very different territorial outcome. So, which one was it? Neither side could agree, and that ambiguity planted a ticking time bomb in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Now, while the politicians squabbled over lines on a map, people on the ground were already settling the land. On one side, you had American settlers arriving with dreams fueled by manifest destiny, a belief that the United States was divinely entitled to stretch from coast to coast. On the other, agents of the British Crown, most notably the Hudson's Bay Company, had already set up shop, raising livestock and claiming authority. So imagine the tension. You've got two flags, two legal systems, and two groups of people who both think they're in charge, all sharing the same island. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as we'll see next, it didn't take long for the powder keg to ignite. And the spark? It wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. It was a pig. Let's set the scene. San Juan Island, June 1859. A peaceful-looking stretch of land with a not-so-peaceful undertone. Tensions had been simmering beneath the surface for years, and then, one morning, a pig wandered into the wrong potato patch. An American farmer named Lyman Cutler walked out to find his hard-earned crop destroyed, again, by a pig that belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company. And in a moment of frustration, or perhaps frontier justice, he shot the pig. That's right. The match that lit an international crisis was one disgruntled farmer and one very unlucky pig. Now, to us, that might sound petty, almost laughable, but to the British, especially the pig's owner, it was an offense with weight. The man demanded compensation, but compensation meant admitting legal responsibility, and responsibility meant acknowledging jurisdiction. And that's where things got political, too fast. You see, neither nation had formally agreed on who actually owned San Juan Island. So when the British demanded payment and the Americans refused, it wasn't just about pork anymore. It was about pride. National pride. This small, almost absurd confrontation exposed the enormous cracks beneath the surface. Who had legal authority here? Who had the right to govern? The answers weren't clear, and because they weren't clear, both sides began to treat the incident as more than a local misunderstanding. It became a symbol of broader US-British tensions, a symbol of unresolved empire. And in a world where flags meant power and maps meant money, neither side wanted to blink first. This wasn't just a case of crops and compensation. This was about sovereignty. And suddenly, everyone, from settlers to naval officers, was forced to choose a side. Now, this is where things start to spiral, because what do you get when you mix ambiguous policy, national pride, and unchecked military authority? You get a standoff that could have started a war over a pig. After the shooting incident, General William Harney, a U.S. Army officer stationed in the region, decided to act. But instead of waiting for orders from Washington, he took matters into his own hands. He deployed U.S. troops to San Juan Island. No congressional debate, no presidential directive, just send the boys in. Why? Because he believed the United States had a right to protect its citizens, and because he didn't want the British gaining the upper hand. But remember, this island's ownership was still unresolved. So from the British perspective, American troops had just invaded disputed territory. And what do you think Britain did? They sent warships. 3 of them. Just imagine it. A remote island in the Pacific Northwest suddenly bristling with muskets, cannons, and confused commanders, none of whom had clear orders on what to do next. The chain of command? Fragile at best. The communication between London, Washington, and their field officers? Weeks delayed. Let's break down how fast this escalated. First, a pig is shot. Then, US troops arrive. Then, the Royal Navy shows up. All of this, without a single formal declaration of war. This wasn't diplomacy, it was improvisation. And the scary part? With armed forces from two empires facing off in such close quarters, it would have taken just one trigger-happy soldier or one misinterpreted command to turn a bizarre episode into a bloody conflict. So the big question became, Would cooler heads prevail? Because at this point, war wasn't just possible, it was one bad decision away. Here's where things take an unexpected, and frankly, refreshing, turn. Because in most stories like this, where empires posture and troops line up, the situation explodes. But not this time. Why? Because of two men who understood something their governments didn't. Let's start with Captain George Piquet. Yes, that Piquet, long before his infamous charge at Gettysburg, he was stationed here on San Juan Island, staring down British ships with a small detachment of American soldiers. He had orders to hold the ground, but not to start a war, and he didn't. On the other side, Rear Admiral Robert Baines, and Baines may very well have saved thousands of lives with a single sentence. When asked if he was going to open fire, he said something that should be carved into every military academy wall. "I will not involve two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig." That's it. That's the quote. And it was that refusal, calm, principled, and quietly defiant, that prevented a needless war. He was under pressure. The British Empire wasn't exactly known for backing down. But Baines saw through the absurdity of the moment. He understood that honor didn't require escalation, and that restraint, especially in matters of war, isn't weakness, it's wisdom. What's remarkable here is that both Piquet and Baines went against the grain. They didn't just follow orders blindly. They used judgment. They talked. They bought time. And that time gave their governments a chance to catch up and realize how close they were to catastrophe. This is one of those rare chapters in history where human judgment, not bureaucracy, not firepower, was the deciding factor. And it worked. So what do you do when two global powers claim the same land, stare each other down, and realize, maybe, just maybe, none of this is worth a war? You improvise. In the wake of the standoff, a temporary, but surprisingly elegant, solution was reached. Instead of fighting over the island, the United States and Britain agreed to something unusual: joint occupation. That's right. Both nations would maintain a military presence on San Juan Island, but they'd do so peacefully, side by side. And it worked. For over a decade, British Marines and American soldiers shared this tiny, tension-soaked island. They built camps, they hosted events, they even played sports together. And all the while, the real war, the war of interpretation, of legalese, of diplomacy, moved behind the scenes. This wasn't just a ceasefire. It was a kind of geopolitical timeout, a slow-motion solution to a problem that had been rushed into existence. Eventually, the dispute went to arbitration, and not just any arbitration, the kind with high stakes and a high-profile referee. In 1871, both nations agreed to let Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany decide the matter. Yes, Germany. And after careful review, his commission sided with the United States. In 1872, the San Juan Islands were officially awarded to the US. The British packed up and left peacefully. No bloodshed, no last-minute betrayals, just resolution. It's rare, remarkable, really. In a century dominated by wars, colonization, and empire building, this was an example of something far less common: restraint, process, and the triumph of diplomacy over ego. The pig war may have started with a shot, but it ended with a handshake. Now let's step back, because the real value of the pig war isn't just in the story, it's in what the story reveals. This wasn't just a quirky incident involving a pig. It was a case study in systemic fragility. And if we look closely, we can see how certain patterns, some timeless, some troubling, played out beneath the surface. First, let's talk about ambiguous policy. The Oregon Treaty left a critical detail: the ownership of the San Juan Islands, open to interpretation. And when policy is vague, especially on matters of territory, it creates space for conflict, not just between nations, but between individuals caught in the middle. Then there's the role of bureaucracy. Neither London nor Washington had real-time control over what their officers were doing. The lag in communication meant field commanders like Harney, Piquet, and Baines were essentially making international policy on the fly. That's a recipe for disaster, unless, as we saw, those individuals rise above their orders. But most importantly, this incident shows what happens when systems lack clarity and accountability. You had an empire-run corporation, the Hudson's Bay Company, acting like a government. You had settlers living under multiple claims of sovereignty. You had military men interpreting diplomatic documents while literally standing in musket range of each other. It's chaos wrapped in protocol. And yet, somehow, it didn't unravel. Why? Because at crucial moments, individuals refused to let systemic dysfunction dictate the outcome. They paused. They questioned. They chose restraint over reaction. That's the real lesson here. When systems break down, or when incentives push people toward escalation, it's the presence, or absence, of human wisdom that determines what happens next. So what do we take away from the pig war? On the surface, it's a historical footnote, a quirky episode tucked between larger wars and louder headlines. But if you read between the lines, it's something more profound. It's a story about power, and how unclear systems can amplify small problems into international crises. It's a story about pride, national pride, personal pride, and the dangerous dance between the two. And most of all, it's a story about prudence, about the quiet strength of choosing not to escalate, even when every incentive tells you to. We tend to think that big problems need big solutions. But sometimes, the best defense against disaster is a well-timed pause, a conversation, a refusal to let titles and uniforms override common sense. The Pig War reminds us that history isn't just shaped by treaties or territories. It's shaped by people, by the decisions they make when no one's watching and everything's at stake. If you enjoyed this breakdown of a lesser-known chapter in global diplomacy, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. Every click helps bring more untold stories to light. And if you prefer to listen on the go, check out the podcast version of this episode. Links down in the description. We've got plenty more strange and revealing episodes of history waiting to be uncovered. So stick around, because sometimes the most ridiculous stories reveal the deepest truths.